Welcome everyone to Domain 2. Here we're going to talk about software and system security. And as you can see on the slide here, we have a few subdomains where we're going to talk about applying security solutions for infrastructure management given a scenario. And we're going to explain best practices for software assurance and hardware assurance. So let's start with subdomain 2.1. The first thing we're going to talk about is cloud versus on-premises. We're going to store information on the cloud, or we're going to keep the information on premises, or we're going to do our work in the cloud, or are we going to do it on premises? There's not one right solution for all of this, but this particular slide shows a lot of considerations that you'll need to, consider when we talk about, are we going to do our work on the cloud, or are we going to do our work on site? So the first one is cost and convenience versus control. One of the big things about the cloud is the cost. It's cheap because you don't have to worry about having your own physical equipment. You don't have to pay for your own physical equipment. You don't have to pay somebody to maintain the physical equipment you don't have. You don't have to pay the utility bills for the physical equipment you don't have. And on top of that, the cloud is convenient because where is the cloud? It's everywhere. It's the internet, essentially. So as long as you can access the internet, you should be able to access the cloud, which means that you can access it from anywhere, almost. You can do your work from almost anywhere if you have internet access. But the other side of that coin is control of your data, control of your applications and your processes. Because when you put stuff in the cloud, it's being controlled by somebody else. You're storing your things, your data, your work on somebody else's stuff. So you are basically giving up a certain level of control depending on which type of service we're talking about. Is that something that your company is willing to do? You may also run into multi-tenancy issues where you might have multiple cloud service customers residing on the same server. Are you okay with that? Are you perhaps controlling or maintaining data that is sensitive and really should not be disclosed accidentally or otherwise to other customers, to other companies? Whether we're talking from a compliance standpoint or whether we're talking about a trade secret type of standpoint. What about your authentication and authorization issues? How easy is it for you to access your cloud data? Is it too hard to access, or is it actually too easy? And when I'm talking about too easy, what I mean by too easy being an issue with authentication and authorization is if it's too easy, as in you just need a username and password to gain access to the cloud, what happens if those passwords and those usernames get compromised somehow? After all, we're all familiar at this point with the Yahoo data breach from a couple of years back. And if you think about a data breach like Yahoo, or if you think about what it took for you as a person to log into your Yahoo account or your Google account back in the day, meaning say 2-3 years ago, all you needed was a username and password, which presents some issues because usernames and passwords are relatively easy to compromise from a authorization standpoint, an authentication standpoint. So if you forgot to log out of your Google account from, say, a public computer, or someone did some shoulder surfing and looked to see and found your username and password, or did some other form of social engineering to gain access, there was not a whole lot of safeguards in place to protect against that. Compare that to today, where if you log into your Yahoo account or your Google account, Gmail, whatever have you, not only now do you have to use your username and password, but now they start checking things. They've tied your account now to your phone. And if you try to log in from a place, from an IP address, from a location that you normally don't, they'll send alerts to your phone and to your email saying, hey, somebody is trying to log into your account at this IP address or on this computer. Is this you? Do you recognize this? And if it's not you, then you can have the option to shut things down. And basically, there's more safeguards in place than there used to be. What about your legal liability? Now, I touched on this for a bit in Domain 1, but remember, just because you send data to be stored somewhere else doesn't mean that your company no longer has liability, no longer has a legal responsibility for that data. So, again, can you trust that cloud provider to properly secure that data? Do you have mechanisms in place to ensure that that cloud provider can protect that data? What about the provider's use of that data? When the cloud service provider collects data on you, or when you send data up to the cloud to be used or to be stored, can the cloud service provider repurpose that data for their own use? Can they take some of that data and resell it somewhere else, for example? Or use that and analyze it in order to learn what people are doing so that they know how to properly market that data or send targeted ads to your customers? And then data jurisdiction and sovereignty. Where the data is being stored physically matters, because this is a concept we'll probably be talking about later on. But depending on where that data is stored, there might be different rules that govern how that data is supposed to be protected, or even things like what kind of access the government has to that data that's being stored. Perhaps certain countries have different laws about how to protect the data, or what rights the government has to data being stored in their own countries, or with regards to their citizens. So these are all questions that your company has to ask themselves when they decide, do we need to store data in the cloud, or do we need to keep data at home on premises? Now, not just talking about cloud versus on premises, but we also need to talk about our assets themselves. And we know that assets are very movable. We know that they travel here and there. So we need to tag our assets. We need to place labels on them to identify them, to track them, to recover them. And I know this sounds obvious, and I'm sure that a lot of companies may consider doing this or have done this already, whether they slap barcodes that scan and say this is what this is, or whether they use technologies like RFID to recognize a piece of equipment or an asset, or use the QR codes, or whatever else. And again, this sounds obvious. This sounds like something that, well, everyone should be doing this already, except that's not always the case. Or sometimes people don't properly implement it all the way. Like they'll put this on their traveling devices and their smaller pieces of equipment, but they don't bother to tag the bigger things because they don't move anywhere. Why bother? Let's talk about segmenting your networks. And when we talk about segmenting the networks, there's different ways we can do this. We can talk about segmenting your networks physically. And on here, we have 4 basic network styles or network areas. that you probably already are familiar with. We have the intranet, we have the internet, we have the extranet, and we have the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. Now, with the intranet, that would be your corporate internal network. And then we have the internet, the outside public network. That's the big scary area because that's where a lot of attacks come from because we can't control what's out there on the internet. However, we do have to interface with the internet. We do have to interface with the public because if we're a company, if we're a business, a lot of times that's where our customers come from, is from the public. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But we also have the extranet. And the extranet is a network that's designed to be used by our business partners or vendors. Because is there some sort of information that perhaps a business partner or a vendor needs? Like, say, shipping schedules or inventories? Sure. I mean, perhaps we're a company that sells widgets and we are the US's #1 manufacturer of widgets, and we've been making widgets for 50 years, and no one can outdo us when it comes to our widget expertise. So does it make sense then that perhaps we might partner with a company or hire a company to do things like, say, ship our widgets to wherever they're going to be sold? Sure. And again, would it make sense that our shipping company would need access to certain pieces of information that the public doesn't need to have, such as inventory, shipping schedules, the amount of widgets that are earmarked for this store versus this store versus this store? Absolutely. But does that mean that this shipping company should have access to all of our internal information? Absolutely not. Hence, the extranet. We put all the information that our various business partners or vendors might need and segregate it in that extranet. Now, finally, we have the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, sometimes known as a perimeter network, or there's other terms such as screen subnet that you might run across. Now, again, we talked about a few moments ago how you need to deal with the public, you need to deal with the intranet and the internet because, well, the public is where we make our money. Public is where our customer base comes from. So yes, we have to deal with them. But again, that is also where most attacks come from because, again, it's the outside area. We can't control that. So it makes sense then that there might be certain pieces of equipment on our networks that have to deal with the public. We call those public-facing servers. Some examples of devices that would have to interface or the design to interface with the public: web servers, VPN concentrators, maybe DNS systems. Who knows? But these hosts that reside in the DMZ, because they are public-facing, because they are designed to work with the public, because they are designed to be interfacing with the public, we can reasonably expect that those are more likely to get attacked than other systems that are not sitting inside the DMZ. So then it makes sense that we should harden and strengthen those particular devices as much as we can to secure them from attacks as much as possible. And that's where we come up with this term called a bastion host. Bastion hosts are hardened systems that reside in the DMZ. Now, a bastion host does not refer to a specific device as in a web server versus an email server or print server or what have you. They're just a generic term referring to hardened devices residing in the DMZ. And just like how the DMZ in the real world separates North Korea from South Korea, the DMZ that we imply on our networks sit between the intranet and our other networks, internet versus intranet, internet versus extranet. Because again, we want that buffer sitting between the internet and those other areas. And here, again, is an example of how someone might, or a company might, set up these various different networks, internet versus intranet versus extranet. So you can see we've got the intranet up on the top side, and then we've got our DMZ where they've got server farms for the internet, web servers, or whatever else. And then you see off to the side, we even have our extranet set up for our business partners. And we got that DMZ also separating our intranet from our intranet. We might segment our networks virtually through concepts such as VLANs, which you probably recall are virtual LANs that we set up on switches on layer 2. And the idea of a VLAN being that we can create our own arbitrary networks, even though these devices that we split into different arbitrary networks may even be connected to the same physical switch. And then we also have virtual machines, VMs. And we'll talk more about virtualization later on. But again, one of the core concepts of virtual machines, virtualization, is that each VM is segregated into its own little sandbox so that whatever happens on one virtual machine does not affect other virtual machines. And then we'll talk about we're talking about the concept of jump boxes, also known as jump servers. And with a jump box or jump server, we have a hardened, strengthened system that connect two networks. And one of those networks is a private network that should have access to it limited. As a matter of fact, that access to this private network should only be done through this jump server. So basically what we're talking about is isolated, controlled access. So here we see that we have an example of how to set up VLANs. And again, there's that concept of having devices connected physically to the same switch, but logically split up into different networks. So we have VLAN 2 and VLAN 3 and VLAN 4, all split up. And as far as the router is concerned, they're all completely different networks, different IPs, everything. Now, here, you can see how we might set up stuff so that we might have jump servers. So in this slide, we have the data center, and that's our very private network that does need to be connected to other areas, does need to have some network connectivity so we're not completely air gapping it, like we've talked about before. But we want to restrict access to it so that we are sure that we can control the access to that data center as much as possible. Therefore, anyone trying to gain outside access to the data center must do so through this jump server, which is hardened against attack and requires very strict access control. And then you see that we've implemented a jump server on the DMZ as well. Because again, when you have jump servers, that is the only means of access, remote access, to a particular area, to a particular network, it's easier to reduce that attack surface of the network because there's only so many places that that particular network can get attacked from the outside, and it all goes through that jump server. But we can also talk about isolating individual systems or networks. Mentioned air gapping a couple of times already, where we can disconnect that system from other networks. Total isolation. Now, air gapping is a pretty secure method, but it's not perfect. It's not foolproof, especially if removable media is involved. And you see that Stuxnet is mentioned. Now, if Stuxnet sounds familiar, that's because it was a virus that attacked Iranian nuclear centrifuges a few years back. And the way that Stuxnet got to these Iranian nuclear centrifuges had to do with removable media, because the Iranian nuclear centrifuges were air-gapped. They were completely disconnected from other networks. But the TLDR version of how Stuxnet got there is Stuxnet was downloaded onto the scientists' personal computers off the internet. But the virus was crafted, the Stuxnet virus, was crafted in such a way that it didn't actually attack those Windows computers. It was designed to trigger on a very specific system, which happened to be the SCADA elements of those Iranian nuclear centrifuges. So the attack happened because the virus was downloaded to the nuclear scientists' computers because of internet, and then from there made their way to the removable media that they used, which then made their way to the work computers that the scientists use at work, which then made their way from those work computers to that SCADA environment, those Iranian nuclear centrifuges. And then from there, once they were on their target environment, then they started attacking and doing their thing, basically causing the centrifuges to overheat and setting the Iranian nuclear centrifuge program back decades. Along that concept of air gapping, we have a computer that you might hear about called a sheep dip computer. And the sheep dip computer is a testing computer. It's isolated and is dedicated to basically being a testing computer. So they use it to test removable media from malware before they interact with the production devices. So if our Iranian nuclear scientists had had a sheep dip computer, perhaps Stuxnet would not have made it to their target, because what they could have done was they could have used this dedicated, isolated sheep dip computer to test their removable media, their USB drives, or whatever they were using, and test them for malware before they actually got to interact with production devices like work computers. Now, let's backtrack a moment and talk about the top of the slide, where we talk about group policy settings, where we talk about how to apply settings to, well, groups. For example, if I want to disable Minesweeper on our work computers, the easiest way for that to happen, or the easiest way to implement that, is to go to the user group and disable Minesweeper, change the group policy that way. So now anyone who's a user no longer has access to Minesweeper. So we can talk about isolating things by changing the group policies so that certain groups don't have access to certain areas or to certain systems. Now, with this particular group policy setting, we're going to talk about 3 different types of settings: managed, unmanaged, and accepted. So managed devices are on the same domain as the isolated system, so however the group policy applies, that's how it works. An unmanaged system means that if it's not on the same domain as the isolated system, can't access it, end of story. Unless, we are talking about accepted systems, where they are not managed, they're unmanaged. In other words, they're not on the same domain as the isolated system. However, they have been given a specific exception to access that isolated system. So what does that look like in practice, or at least in picture form? Well, I'm glad you asked. Here we are. So computer 1 is managed because it's on the same domain as our isolated server. So however the group policy applies for computer 1, that defines the access that they have to server 1. With computer 2, unmanaged, they do not have access to that server at all. So if they try to initiate communications to server 1, they can't authenticate themselves. They will not be allowed. And then server 3, an exception was written for that particular computer. It's not on a trusted same domain. However, you can access it because that particular computer, computer number 3, was given an exception to be able to access server number 1. So they can initiate communications even though they're not, necessarily authenticated to each other, where they have proven beyond the shadow of a doubt they are who they say they are. Now let's move on to network architecture. Now we're going to talk about these different components of the network architecture in turn, where we'll talk about physical network architecture, we'll talk about SDN, software-defined networking, we'll talk about the virtual private cloud, and we'll talk about VPNs, virtual private networks. So starting up with the physical architecture of the network, the actual devices, the actual cables. So with physical architecture of the network, securing it, we're going to talk about security devices, whether we're talking about firewalls, or whether we're talking about IDSs and IPSs, or we're talking about UTMs, Unified Threat Management Devices, those all-in-one appliances that we like to use more and more nowadays. Now, there is no set, you must have X amount of devices and you must have one of these and one of those and two of the other. Because again, all of that depends on your individual company and your individual company's needs. But what we can talk about as best practice, no matter what kind of company we're talking about, is that you should strongly consider the concept of defense in depth, where we have layered security. And by that I mean, don't just rely on one piece of security to protect everything. Strongly consider having one piece of security behind another. And on top of that, you should employ vendor diversity when we talk about this concept of defense in depth. And what I mean by that is, don't just rely on one vendor's products to provide all of your defenses. Don't rely on, say, Cisco, as an example, to provide all your firewalls, plus your IDS systems, plus whatever other security concepts you employ. And the reason we should employ vendor diversity, the reason we should have more than one vendor supplying our different various layers of security is because if one vendor is supplying all of our defenses, what happens if that vendor has a flaw in their security? That means then that that flaw applies to all of our devices. For example, there was a flaw in some versions of Cisco PIX firewalls called extra bacon. Kind of like what you put on your burger, except all one word. And this extra bacon flaw, if it was not patched, basically allowed an attacker who knew what they were doing to walk through those firewalls like they weren't even there. So if we had nothing but Cisco firewalls of this particular model or brand, then that means that even though we had 3 layers of firewall, for example, an attacker could use that extra bacon vulnerability to walk through each of those firewalls and basically render them all useless. But if we had employed vendor diversity and had Cisco here and Barracuda there and Ironwall is our 3rd layer, then even if our first layer of Cisco firewall was susceptible to extra bacon, that extra bacon vulnerability was not present on Barracuda firewalls and Ironwall firewalls, so there was still a level of protection for our network. So that's why vendor diversity is an important concept to keep in mind when we talk about defense in depth. You make sure that one single flaw does not endanger your entire architecture.